everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing red-black in MKM. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes for tier 2, whatever it's called, and above patrons. So, red-black is the second worst performing two-color pair on 17 lands, and it's somewhat overdrafted. It's like the fourth least drafted or something. It's drafted more than a number of decks that perform better than it. I don't think that it's a thing that should be I think that it should be drafted at a pretty low rate. I think that when I personally have thought about or explored red-black, I approached it incorrectly. I had some very, very early experience in the format, losing to just very good aggressive menace heavy draws, and kind of expected that that's what red-black would want to be doing. When I've tried operating in that space, I've typically found that my cards were overall too low impact, and I couldn't really get enough of a clock down, and ended up losing to my opponent's more powerful cards, which is kind of also what's happened with a lot of my blue tempo decks. So I don't think that that's the right way to approach it. I think that menace aggro structurally doesn't work very well in the format because the menace creatures aren't that hard to block, and you don't get enough power into play to put your opponent on the defensive most of the time. So then, if you end up in a spot where you're racing, you're probably losing the race. So it's just pretty poorly positioned to go all in on the cheap menace aggressive creatures. What red-black does have going for it is that it has a really large amount of pretty good removal spells. So I think what it wants to be doing is playing a proactive small game attrition deck. So you do want to get small bodies into play. And you do want to be getting a clock down and attacking your opponent. But you want to be thinking about your deck as an attrition deck rather than a pure aggro or tempo deck. And you want your threats to be inherently object advantageous rather than keyword focused. So you're less interested in menace and more interested in the cards that offer some kind of inherent object advantage. So Dogwalker, the 3/1 morph that when you turn it face over, you get 2 tapped 1/1 dogs. Person of Interest, the 4-mana 2/2 that suspects itself and makes another 2/2 detective. Unscrupulous Agent, the 2-mana 1/1 that makes your opponent exile a card from their hand when it enters the battlefield. Cards like that, where if you play those things and a bunch of removal, then you can kill all of your opponent's creatures that are not small, and then their small creatures end up trading with the creature part of your small creatures, and then you're up some tokens or a discard or something like that. You won't be able to play exclusively card advantageous creatures, but you want to prioritize those and play as many of them as you can, along with a bunch of efficient removal. And then you want the rest of your cards to be a little bit more high impact rather than super low curve. So where in red-green I was advocating for just maximizing 1-drops, here, I don't think you want to do that. I don't think you're really that interested in Gorehounds or Goblin Mask Makers. I think those cards just don't do enough in the small attrition games that you're trying to play. And you'd rather have just an Alley Assailant, the 3-mana 3/3 that enters tapped or can morph and then drains your opponent for 3 when you flip it over, just because it's more likely that you can kill your opponent's things that are larger than it, and then it can outclass your opponent's remaining things, and it's pretty cheap, and so it can meaningfully establish a clock while you play your kill everything that matters game. So the reason that I think you want to be proactive and you care about establishing a clock, is that I do think that you will ultimately lose to the decks that are more colors than you and a lot of the blue decks. Like, it's not hard to have more card advantage than red-black does. And so if all you do is just like kill all their stuff, they'll eventually just draw more cards and have more stuff than you have removal spells. So you need to be attacking them while you kill their stuff so that the game ends before they can like reach the point where they just attrition you into like they have cards and you don't. So you need to play like a proactive strategy, but where you're keeping all of your opponents like meaningfully sized creatures out of the way. If all the pieces come together, you might be able to like get an aggressive deck sometimes, like a more pure aggressive deck sometimes. But I don't think that it's something that I would ever try to aim for in red-black. I also don't think red-black is an archetype that you should set out to draft. Today, for example, I often, in the streams before my podcast, try to draft the deck that the podcast will be about to like get a little bit more experience and showcase it. But I think that forcing red-black is not something that you want to try to do. And so it didn't seem useful to like go into a draft trying to force it. What you're looking for, like basically looking at the red-black decks that actually trophied, almost all of them have multiple very good, honestly, mythics. I was going to say rares, but it's like most of the decks that I looked at that trophied that were red-black had more than one great mythic in addition to good rares. I'm sure that a sufficient number or quality of rares can get it done without mythics. And, obviously if you're just in an open seat and get all the right pieces and don't have high rarity cards, it's possible to win. But for the most part, I think that like the commons and uncommons available to red-black and the strategy that you can make out of them just isn't better than what you can do in other colors. The commons and strategies and synergies between those commons and uncommons in other color combinations is basically just better than it is in red-black. So the only reason to draft red-black is that you got some really powerful cards that were red and or black, and the other or both of those colors were open. And so my intention, what I'm trying to communicate here isn't here's a way to approach a draft and like if you draft this kind of like red-black attrition deck, like you'll have a good deck. This is more like when you get good rares that put you in red-black, how do you draft to take advantage of that seat rather than like getting punished for opening good rares? Because like obviously opening good rares is something like you want to know how to take advantage of that, and you don't want to like lose a draft because you got trapped into like a seat, like an archetype that you didn't know how to draft or drafted incorrectly, and then like you lose because you have good cards. That's a really bad place to be. You lose a lot of equity if you don't know how to put yourself in the best seat to use the like powerful cards that you get. So coincidentally, another good thing about prioritizing removal and these like value creatures, it's like not a very exploitable strategy, and it pivots nicely into playing a more controlling game, such that like if your person of interest and unscrupulous agents are insufficient to actually clock your opponent, well, maybe you'll just draw your giant dragon or demon or massacre girl or whatever good rare it is that you have in your deck, and then you can win the game with that. So, I mean, a lot, like, given that this set has a higher rare density than other sets due to the pack composition, a lot of the archetypes do end up being significantly about the rares that you get. And I think that's particularly true in red-black because you should only be there if you have the right rares for it. So a lot of the point here is just red-black inherently isn't very good. Don't do the like menace aggro thing. It's too easy to stop. There aren't really enough cards that pay you for it, and your cards are just going to be too weak overall. The removal is good, and the positioning that removal puts you in conjunction with the rares that you have, is such that you generally want your red-black decks to be drafted around rares rather than around tricks. Like, it's notable that combat tricks play well with Menace. Menace puts your opponent in a spot where they double block, and then you can exploit that with cards, with really any trick, but like the Chase is On or Toxin Analysis are good examples of cards that play particularly well with Menace. And I think that trying to do that thing is just not the right approach to red-black. I think it is better to minimize your tricks, maximize your removal, not need to worry about being in a spot where your opponent has to try to... the problem is your opponent knows that these tricks exist and are very good with your menace creatures. So if you make a suspicious attack with a menace creature, if your opponent's not under a lot of pressure, they can just not block. And it's really hard for the average red-black draw to put your opponent under enough pressure to get into those spots where you can really make use of those combat tricks. And so it's a lot safer to not try to play those menace creatures and combat tricks to like get that spot, and instead just play value creatures and removal and powerful cards. I do expect that, if you've played this format a decent amount, you've probably seen a couple of like very, very swingy blowouts happen with like menace creature plus combat trick, or you've seen effective aggressive starts from red-black decks. These things do happen, but I think that they happen too inconsistently for it to be like strategically wise to prioritize that or kind of chase that dream. I think that red-black decks want to be drafted much more conservatively, and you just want it to be about consistent value, finding your rares, killing your opponent's big threats. I've talked previously in this set about having a more sealed deck style mindset and approach to things. And I think that this is another archetype where that very much applies. It shouldn't be about the synergies inherent to red-black. You should be trying to disrupt your opponent's synergies, and you should be relying on the individual power level of your cards and kind of eking out value wherever you can off of any of the cards that do that for you. So that's kind of it. Given that this is a low synergy strategy, the cards that you're like, you basically want to prioritize cards in accordance with how good they are individually. So like the win rates of cards in general are pretty easy to look up and reasonable to apply here, as long as you look for cards that fit this kind of strategy and just take relatively good creatures, go to removal spells, don't worry too much about like keywords and combat tricks, and just try to have your cards line up favorably on a one-for-one kind of basis with your opponent's cards. And that's it. I expect this to be a relatively short episode because, like I said, I think it's all fairly simple. But I am going to turn it over to chat with questions. So happy to elaborate on any of these points, or debate some of the utility of like menace or combat tricks or whatever if there are believers, while I'm letting people get some discussion points or questions or whatever in chat. I want to thank the newest patrons. So thank you, Evan and Twigs. Appreciate the support. If anyone else is interested in supporting Drafting Archetypes, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. All right. One of the difficulties of the classic red-black small attrition game in this format is the Ward 2 on disguise creatures. Play high power, low toughness threats, and swing while clearing out blockers is harder to use as a baseline strategy. Yes, that's why I'm not advocating high power, low toughness creatures. I think that you're generally looking for creatures that win fights. That's why I was talking about how, like, I think Alley Assailant, the 3/3, is better than like Gorehounds and Mask Makers. Is you don't want to put yourself in a spot where you have to use removal on your opponent's disguise creatures. You want to play creatures that trade favorably with disguise creatures like Dogwalker and Person of Interest, or cards that beat disguise creatures in combat, which force your opponent to flip them over, which expose them to your instant speed removal spells. And you're not looking to like play a 3/1 and then use a removal spell on their 3 mana creature and attack. You need to let the game go a little bit longer and have your creatures be a little bit bigger so they can still be proactive, but you never want a thing that's going to like match up poorly against your opponent's 2/2. How does red black value big versus small removal? I assume you're talking about like small removal as shock, big removal as murder. I think the answer is basically that you want to mix. You're looking to play a reasonably large number of removal spells, and you have access to a pretty wide variety of removal spells. And given that you're like looking to play a bunch, you just don't end up being that picky about it, and you end up with a pretty good variety, and then like you just line it up appropriately. You mentioned not trying for Menace. Yes. But do you think there exists a different red-black Menace style deck that you don't try for but could end up in? Like I said, you will see that stuff happen. And like if you get all the right stuff, like you might end up with a good deck, but I don't think you should try for it. Like I think that like even the good version of it is going to be very inconsistent in its gameplay. It's going to be like both draw and matchup dependent, and require that the rest of your draft go well after you start down that direction. I just think it's too inconsistent. Does the 2/4 leech change how you value small menace creatures? Yes, a little bit. Dual Leech is certainly like the best like menace lord, like reason to be menace in the set. I think Dual Leech forgives Gorehound a little bit. I still don't want to like prioritize like Gorehound or Menace because of Dual Leech. Like I'm fine to just use Dual Leech with Dogwalkers and Person of Interest and Unscrupulous Agent. Like I have enough other cards that play well with Dual Leech that I don't need to go out of my way to put Menace creatures in the deck. And I do think that Dual Leech is a really good card for the deck, right? Like, because I was talking about how you want to try to be proactive, and Dual Leech makes that much easier. But I don't think you want to like go really hard on pushing the Menace theme because of Dual Leech. Like I don't think that Dual Leech makes your repeat offenders, the 2-mana 2/1 that you can spend mana to suspect and then spend mana to put counters on it. I don't think that card's like a lot better because you have Dual Leech. People usually ask about on-ramps as a podcast subject, but what about off-ramps? How are you finding your way out of this deck after opening the rares? Colorless fixing to make things splashy, good splashable blue cards that help you draw and have better late game. Drafting flexibly is the best off-ramp for anything. The best ways to draft flexibly are prioritize removal, focus on one of your colors rather than drafting your 2 colors evenly so that you can pivot out of the other color or into splashing the other color. Like in pack 1, if I'm, say, red-black or really any 2 colors, I'd often try to like focus on red or focus on black rather than drafting them evenly so that if I open some kind of bomb like a Vindicator or a Cryptic Code or something in pack 2, then I can drop the second color and switch into that other second color. I think that actually I was drafting right before this podcast started, and in pack 1, I was close to mono red. I had like a green card or 2 and a white card or 2, and then I opened Cryptic Coat in pack 2, and because almost all of my picks in pack 1 were red, it was very easy to just say, okay, I'm blue-red now. So focus on one color, prioritize fixing, and don't take unimportant cards in your color or colors over potentially very high impact cards in another color, so that you, like, because you usually don't give anything up when you don't take a card that's low impact. You'll find enough playables without it. And if you're seeing a potentially high impact card in like the middle of pack 1, it's not unlikely that you'll see more cards in that color after that. And so by taking something that looks pretty speculative at the moment, what you're doing is giving yourself the ability to move into that open lane. As for like whether red-black should do anything special to like maximize those off ramps, I don't think you, like, I think that you should do all of that stuff just kind of as good practice in general. And I think it's worth noting that because red-black is prioritizing generically independently strong creatures and removal spells rather than pushing explicit synergies, it becomes a lot easier to pivot off of it or into a 3-color deck or into a different color. Where if you were prioritizing menace creatures and combat tricks, or just like a very, like, trying to find what synergies there are in the red-black aggressive space, I think it becomes a lot harder to pivot off. A lot of your cards are less useful in other places. So I kind of think that the flexibility and ability to pivot out of red-black is an inherent strength of having this approach and mentality when you're drafting red-black. So it's less something that you need to go out of your way to do and more something that should be built into this approach as another advantage to approaching red-black this way. Best color to splash into red-black. I don't know that it matters. As long as you're actually red-black splashing something, the thing you're splashing is probably just some kind of like late-game bomb. Because you don't really need to splash removal. You have plenty of that in your colors. And it's not like there's some kind of like compulsive research style, like meaningfully, like impactful blue card draw spell you could be splashing or something. So I think it's just, if you're splashing, it's for a bomb, or it's because you're pivoting. Like, maybe the answer is green because 3-color green decks are easier, but at that point you're not splashing green and red-black, you're pivoting into Jund. So yeah, I don't have a specific color that you should be expecting to splash in red-black. So among the common and uncommon disguise creatures, it sounds like the archetype is only interested in playing Dogwalker and Gadget Technician with the disguise mode. Are there also other disguised creatures that this archetype wants to play? Like, honestly, the red-black guy, Shady Informant or whatever, isn't the worst here. I don't like it very much, even when it's on color, because it's not something I'm ever that excited about casting face up. But it does, trade favorably in small games. Like, it is in line with what the deck is trying to do. So I don't think that one's terrible. Person of interest is, like, the monocolor ones I think are generally not bad, right? Like, Offender at Large is very good. Alley Assailant I've talked about. The Moroi is fine. I'm not, in general, I'm like relatively okay with playing Basilica Stalker, the 3/4 flyer, flying black morph. As far as the other gold morphs, like, I'm not very excited about a Savior or a 6/7. I definitely don't want a 3/3 Death Touch. Fairy Snoop is, like, okay if you're, like, more heavy black, but not great. Yeah, I think mostly Dogwalker and Technician as far as, like, the gold ones. And then a lot of the monocolor ones are good. So you start on Pyrotechnic Performer and follow that up with a Hunted Bone Brute. Is attrition still your preferred route, or is a disguise-heavy version of red-black too different? I mean, so both of those are really, really strong, aggressive creatures that pressure your opponent's life total that you definitely want to play. but I don't think I would draft very differently based on them. Like, neither one of, like, a Gorehound isn't going to change the clock for either of those cards in a meaningful way. Whereas like dog walkers and offender at large and person of interest are going to play pretty well with what those are doing. Also, the best thing you can have, in my experience with Hunted Bone Brute, is just a removal spell, because like you flip over the Bone Brute and it hits them for 6. And then your opponent's really far behind, so they have to try to double block it. And then if you kill one of their blockers and they can't block it that turn and you hit them again, then they're at a spot usually where even if they can double block the following turn, losing the 3 life from its dies trigger kills them. This is like if you're on the play with a Bone Brute in a spot where you can actually be aggressive with it. So no, I think even if I had both of those cards, I would still approach it pretty similarly. They just really help with like the aggressive part of the plan that you want anyway. Would I play Judith in red-black? Would she change how you draft at all? I'm low experience with Judith. I'm open to playing Judith. Judith is in line, or at least drafting to support Judith is not going far out of my way from drafting this way. Judith would make me prioritize removal even more highly than I was otherwise planning to, which was very highly. But I wouldn't mind, trying out Judith in a red-black removal heavy deck. And it certainly would, double down on how much I don't want to be playing, aggressive, like low-impact creatures. Is push-pull a good finisher for red-black? Yes. I think push-pull, yeah, I mean, like, I like push-pull a lot as a card. There are aggressive decks where I haven't been happy with it, but red-black is, like, mid-rangey enough that I think push isn't going to be very awkward. And when you're, like, actively clocking your opponent plus killing things, plus trying to play higher impact creatures, plus trying to play, like, enter the battlefield creatures, I think that pull is very likely to play really well. So very happy with push pull in red black. I don't have like a particularly precise ranking of where Judas should be taken or before. Like I said, I don't have experience with it personally. I would probably try taking it a little bit higher than it should be taken, but not very highly, to try it out. If you're, when in doubt, don't take Judith, I think is a fine algorithm to apply. As far as like which removal spell you would take over it, like, it just depends too much on where you are in the draft. And even if we're talking about like very early, I don't have enough information to say. Like, if the question is Judith a bomb that I should prioritize? No. Is it possible to draft a deck such that Judith is worth playing? Probably. Isaiah MTG, I agree with your takeaways. I think that's a reasonable way to wrap this up. Big major takeaways: play more removal, try to play creatures that combat well versus morph creatures, focus less on menace small creatures, more on attrition. I agree with all of that. Don't go out of your way to draft red black. You want like good rares and stuff to be putting you into the color combination. It's not something that you should just like set out to be early, and try to draft it flexibly such that you are looking to and able to pivot out of it if the draft presents the opportunity to. You really don't want to be playing an underpowered red-black deck. You do want to be in a position to pressure your opponent's life total where possible. The more and stronger your rares are, the less you need to do that, and the more you can increase your prioritization of defensive creatures and removal spells over creatures that attack relatively well. Among creatures that attack well, you are looking to prioritize creatures that come with inherent object advantage, such as Dogwalker, Person of Interest, and Unscrupulous Agent. I would say that that's the kind of quick final summary of what's going on with this archetype. So, thanks for tuning in, and I'll be back next week. We are getting toward the back end of MKM. I know that we're at a time when previews for Thunder Junction are going to be starting up pretty soon. We do still have a few more weeks of this, though, so We're not, into the final boarding stages yet, but I am starting to think about Thunder Junction and scheduling that kind of stuff. So I've still been enjoying MKM. I feel like there are mixed opinions on this set, and my perceptions seem to be mixed. But I'm still liking it, still having fun with it, and still planning to cover some more episodes in the next week. So have a good week, everyone, and I'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.